Hi, and welcome to this week's Wu Wei Wisdom Life Lessons teaching. It's great to be back with you all. This week, we are talking all about self-blame and the painful emotions of guilt and shame that we can experience when we blame ourselves. Now, so many of our clients suffer unnecessarily because they are stuck in a cycle of constantly blaming themselves and constantly beating themselves up for past mistakes, for childhood trauma or abuse, for their parents' behaviour, for relationship breakdowns or family struggles. The list goes on. Well, in this teaching, you'll learn the origin of this self-blame habit and the steps that you need to take to finally break free of blame and shame. Okay, David, so how common is self-blame amongst your clients?
I think it's very common, it's strange because the last 2 or 3 videos, the subject has always come down to the core of it being the inner child. And this blaming, if you think about it, it's very much what a child kind of needs to do, to blame someone, to blame them. It's their fault or it's my fault. And so this blaming is very important in understanding the inner child work and also understanding what a very strong effect it has on your life and your thinking.
But David, a lot of people would argue that if I am blaming myself and suffering because of it, it's because the truth is I have done something wrong. Therefore, how can I not blame myself? How can I just pretend like nothing has happened?
Well, I think then, Alex, it would be what is the incident that you're talking about? And I think that's what happens is the incident that happens. And let's say you have made a genuine mistake, a miscalculation, you've done something wrong. Let's say that that is the case. But what happens is you pile all the emotions on it. And it's almost like, I often say to my clients, it's like a big ball of wool or spaghetti. And you have to pull each strand out and have a look at it. Because we as human beings, we only learn by making mistakes. So I'm sure that in your life, like I have, you have made a mistake. Now, the first thing is to understand not to beat yourself up and to punish yourself for making that mistake, but what was the process that led up to you making that mistake? Because that's why we call these videos life lessons. If you don't learn the lesson, you simply just repeat the mistake. And this is what this self-blame gets you into what we call the carousel of despair.
And I suppose from what you've just said, David, we can't get off that carousel of blame or despair because we get so preoccupied and so overwhelmed by the red light emotions of guilt, shame, anxiety, or anger, anger against ourselves that are created because we are thinking that was my fault. I should have been better. I should have done better. They suffered because of me. Things went wrong because of me. And the whole thing gets very jumbled up and clouded up with the emotions.
And that's absolutely right, Alex, because that becomes the lens that you view the world and people and your life and situations through. That kind of really shaded lens of it must be me. And this is so important in the inner child work, because if you can get down to the first incident that I call the vow, the VOW, the vow, when something goes wrong in your childhood, it might be a kind of a dysfunctional family situation or bullying at school or being picked on or whatever it is. And then that child says the first blame. It can't be them, can it? It can't be my parents. So it must be me. There's something wrong with me. And then from that first kind of seed of blaming yourself, then comes the next layer, what we call the 3 lies. It means I'm not good enough. I can't cope, I'm unworthy, or I'm unlovable. And so then you build on from that foundation. I often think about it like an inverted triangle or a pyramid upside down. From that first blame, it must be me. There's something wrong with me. And you may use different words. You may say, oh, it's because I'm stupid, or it's because I'm too fat or too thin, or I didn't mix in with my mother didn't like me, my father beat me up, whatever it is. But if you think about it, it will have the basis that there's something wrong with me. And then from that basis, you build the rest of the vision that you see life through.
So what you're saying is we carry that vow of self-blame, it must be me, from a childhood experience right into adulthood. And so would you say that for your clients that you work with nowadays, David, as adults, those that are blaming themselves, those that are beating themselves up, those that are ashamed for things they have done in the past or are doing now in their relationships, would you say most of those clients are doing that because they've carried this vow from childhood that the problem is me?
Well, this is why this is such an interesting question that somebody's written in and asked us, because this can have many views. And I can imagine now somebody's watching this and screaming at me and saying, it wasn't me that blamed me, it was my father that blamed me, or my mother that blamed me, or my teacher that blamed me. But at the end of the day, you have to believe that they're right. So if your mother or your father or your grandparents or your teachers kind of, well, it's you, you're not good enough, you're not as good as your brother, you're not as clever as your sister, whatever. There must be a point, like a flick of a switch, where you say they're right, there's something wrong with me. And that's the point that we're calling accountability or self-responsibility. That's the point where you take on that and you own it.
Yeah.
And it becomes your filter. And then from then on, it's very easy. What we call familiar. And can I just spend a couple of moments on that? Because I get a couple of feedbacks on my clients and saying it's more than familiar. But this word familiar, don't underestimate the power of this word, of doing something because it's just very familiar. Many of my clients will say, well, it's easier, it's ingrained, it's my nature. No, it's just familiar. And so when you've done this, and I say the inner child is formed between about 6, 9 years old, around that time, when you start to blame yourself, then this way of blaming yourself or swinging the pendulum the other way and blaming other people. So you fall into the blame game.
Okay.
You're either blaming yourself or blaming them, blaming you, blaming them, blaming you, and you lose track of the Wu way of living in your flow, of solving these problems. And that's really what these videos are about, encouraging you to be responsible and to live in your Wu way, to live in your flow.
Because David, I was going to say to you that if we can, there's nothing wrong with being accountable and taking responsibility for actions that we believe that we shouldn't have done, mistakes that we made, because none of us are perfect. So take accountability, personal accountability and personal self-responsibility is very Wu way, very balanced.
Absolutely.
Blaming ourselves is out of balance, is not Wu way, it's Yu way. It's going against ourselves. So I can see as an adult how that would work and the clear difference between the two. But when we were a child, I'm wondering that we took accountability, we blamed ourselves for things that actually weren't our fault. And that's the big difference. I think a lot of people who are suffering from this self-blame habit now as an adult, I'm wondering whether that as a child, they took responsibility for things that were not their responsibility.
Absolutely, 100%. You also smuggled in a really interesting word there, perfection. Taking the blame and perfection are bed partners.
Yeah.
Because most of my clients will absolutely, although they can't defend it, although they can't rationalize it, they will believe the way out of this is if they were perfect or if somebody else was perfect and nothing ever went wrong. So you're absolutely right that this blame game, that when you were a child, let's say you did do something wrong, you did something and it was out of character. But really, that's what emotional education is all about. Surely the relevant parent, the teacher in the situation, should have taught you so you understand the life lesson. What led up to making that misjudgment? Why did you do that? Because, for instance, say selfish. Well, it's just me. I want it. I'm not going to give this or share this toy or something. Then the parents should be able to teach you that flow, but they don't. What they do, they jump into the blame game because they're already committed to the blame game. And it's much easier to blame. Well, it's you. You're stupid. You're not good. You can't do maths. You can't do English. You're not a very good speller. Oh, it's just part of your nature. They don't sit and don't educate you on to understand that we can change this. This is very important now, what I'm going to say. You now, as the adult, as the mature spiritual person, it is now your role to do this for your inner child. This is why I like this analogy of the inner child. I see this you as your spiritual parent, and this part of your mind is your spiritual child that didn't get the education that you've said, that were told that they were wrong. They were told they're either right or wrong, my way or no way, yes, no, black, white. That's how they were brought up. Now it's your role, your job, whatever word you want to call it, responsibility to step in and to educate that part of your mind. Because if you don't, then that part of your mind takes over and it's in control. When the going gets tough and problems come, the inner child part of your mind goes back to the familiar way of dealing with it. And somebody wrote a really interesting reply on one of our YouTubes. They said, well, why should I do it? This was what they said. Why should I do it when my parents didn't do it to me? Think about that. It was a great question. David, why should I look after myself when my parents didn't do what they were supposed to do? And that's what gets you stuck on the loop. Because if you don't do it, you're just committing yourself to a life of the same, just repeating it. And if you think somebody owes you something, my parents should have done better, they should have educated me more, they should have been cleverer, they should have guided me more, they should have loved me more, they should have protected me more. And because they didn't do it, I'm not going to do it. This is not clear thinking. This is confused thinking. Because if you think you're owed something from someone else, you know what that does? That commits you to collecting the installments. That keeps you connected to that energy for the rest of your life. Instead of drawing a line and saying, they couldn't do it for whatever reason. I'm not going to investigate the reason. They didn't have the capability. That's how they were brought up. They actually thought it. It doesn't really matter. What really matters is, are you going to do it for you? Do you think you're worth it? Or do you want to spend your life, as Alex says, blaming yourself, blaming them, blaming other people, creating the emotion of shame? Do you want to keep on going around and around?
I'm wondering though, David, that if we are, as an adult, still blaming ourselves for past mistakes, for our relationship breakdowns, for problems in our family or friends currently, I'm wondering whether that's, mainly because if we were told or we believed that we were at fault as a child, that we weren't good enough, that everything was our fault, that we're just replaying this same playbook. And I don't know how many people would be just doing that behaviour, continuing to do that behaviour just because they were expecting some sort of payback. I'm wondering whether it's more because we've just got into this habit of saying everything is my fault, and now we are every time something goes wrong in our adult life, that we use that as the kind of confirmation bias that, yes, everything is my fault. Here I go again. Here's another failed relationship. Here's another argument with my parents. Here's my partner being upset with me again. There you go. It just proves I'm no good.
That's right. But as all that is the consequence of believing that.
Okay.
So you've fallen into what the self-fulfilling prophecy. So as you said, it's about what you believe. And this is why I want you to move the filter. Not filter and look at the world and yourself and other people through the filter of the inner child, of a 6-year-old child who sees things very narrow. I want you to widen that filter, and I would call it Shen. You may call it spirituality. The basis that connects you to that, as I try and say on every video, truth, honesty, and integrity. Truth. Do you believe it, the truth? What goes through your self-talk, what comes out of your mouth, is that your truth? Don't say, well, I say this because they said it. They treated me this way, so I'm going to, because that's not your truth. Maybe their truth, but not your truth. Take responsibility, as you said, be accountable. Don't worry where you got it from. You should say, I beat myself up because that's my truth. And then I can ask you the golden thread question. Why is that your truth? Don't go back to say, well, my parents did it. Why is it your truth? And that's what I'm trying to say. It's about basing your life on your truth. Honest. Speak your truth honestly. Don't be ashamed of it. Don't be ashamed of it if it's your truth. If you say, no, David, I think I should beat myself up. And I say, why? And you go, well, I think it's a good idea. I think it's a good idea to beat myself. I think I deserve to be beaten up. I think when people make a mistake, David, I think all human beings, when they make a mistake, they should be beaten to an inch of their life. If that's what you truly believe, then you're honest. Integrity, very important. I used to say on these videos, integrity means walking the walk and talking the talk. And I think that's a good explanation. I think a stronger one as well is think of the opposite of integrity. The opposite of integrity is hypocrisy, being a hypocrite. So saying one thing and then doing something else, or saying, well, this only applies to me.
Well, yeah.
That's a dual belief system.
Because what I was going to say, David, is I think the stress test technique that you talk about quite often would be particularly useful here, because if every time something doesn't go how we would like it to go, or if every time someone brings us a problem or a gripe or a concern and we blame ourselves, if that was our best friend, or if that was someone we loved dearly and the same thing happened to them, would we blame them in the same harsh, unmerciful way? And I don't think we ever would.
Well, this is what the subscriber said.
Yeah.
She said, I will, because my parents did it to me.
Yeah.
And so therefore, if they did it to me,
Yeah.
then I'm going to do it for them. But I do not believe that has truth, honesty, and integrity.
So how do we? I can understand the logical, rational argument you are making here, which appeals to our adult understanding. However, that logical, rational argument does not, I sense that does not touch the inner child in terms. So what do we, because it's our inner child that's creating this problem. We created this blame habit in our childhood. It got fixed in our mind, in that part of our mind that we call our inner child when we were young. And now we've brought that part of our psyche with us through our teenage years into adulthood. And we are using it as a playbook. But it's our inner child's playbook. It's not our authentic self's playbook. It's not our spiritual self's playbook. It's very much the inner child's playbook. So our authentic self understands the truth. Our spiritual self understands the truth, but the inner child doesn't, because your logic doesn't make sense to the inner child. What do we need to say to our inner child the next time it goes to blame us for something and to berate us?
So it's a great question. So what Alex has just asked now is the reparenting of the inner child. So we've done a series of 3 on that. Please look in the archives and we go through this step by step as best we can to kind of give you the ideas. So the first thing that you said was the most important thing. You said the mature, the adult, spiritual self agree. Now I'm saying that a lot of the time you intellectually agree, but you hypocritically do not walk that walk.
So we agree with the logic, but we still let our inner child
We
rule
still-
our thoughts
Exactly.
and our self-talk.
Exactly. We still surrender to the inner child. I called it familiar. I said easy. Now you used another one earlier. Oh, it's a habit. You see what people say? It's a habit, David. Well, a habit is just a choice that you set on a default. And so intellectually, you may not be able to sit there and argue or give me a good counterbalanced discussion. So intellectually you accept it, but you're not owning it. And that's what I call owning it. You're not walking that walk. It's your integrity. If you really believe it, you should be walking that walk. Then, to answer your question, when that part of your mind pipes up, you are now in a position to reparent it in the way that your physical parents couldn't.
Yeah, okay.
You now go, whoa. And that's where people sometimes get confused. So let me make it clear. When I say stop it, when I say stop it, I'm speaking to the adult. Do stop yourself. Don't follow the child. Don't do what the child says. So if your child came home from school and said something, you wouldn't say, well, you're right, I'm going to think that. You would discuss it through with them. You wouldn't say, well, you're right, your teacher's stupid. You'd listen and the child saying, teacher's stupid, you're really stupid. You wouldn't go, yes, that's right. I'm going to go in and see the teacher tomorrow and say, teacher, you're stupid. You wouldn't do that. You'd sit and you'd discuss and find what the root of the problem is. You'd parent the child.
You'd find the misunderstanding.
And
that
the child might be correct. The teacher might be a poor teacher. But then you would go and address the teacher. You wouldn't storm into the classroom and say, you're stupid because my 6-year-old says you're stupid. And that's what you have to do to your inner child. You have to stop yourself being carried along, what you call the habit, or a lot of people call familiarity, because it's easier. Oh, I'm just responding to my emotions. Oh, I don't control my emotions. And all of this we talk about in all the videos. You stop that. You look at your intellect, what you believe to be the truth. You have that discussion. This is what I would call a meditation. You may call it self-focusing, going for a walk, doing a cake, whatever you do just to calm yourself down and listen to what that part of your mind is saying and talk it through and rationalize it, bringing it out of the extreme of the emotional pendulum into the Wu Wei center. And then you deal with it rationally, appropriately, and more importantly for me, with your Shen, spiritually. And that's your Wu Wei. I might not agree, other people may not agree. But here's the integrity. Do you agree? Is it your truth? Not responding on somebody else's truth.
And David, I know you've done this work with so many of your clients, this inner child reparenting work on this issue of self-blame and guilt and shame. In your experience, is it almost like a massive unburdening or like a massive weight is removed from them? Because I would imagine if someone has been blaming themselves from their early childhood years for many decades, they've dragged that anchor throughout their life and it's had so many negative repercussions. Is it almost like an enlightenment when it happens?
I think when the final click happens, Alex, that's a lovely question. I think the final click is, I would call it the enlightenment. What it is really, when I'm working with a client, it seems to me like we're deconstructing. We're kind of gently pulling apart all of the evidence, the so-called evidence that the child has built up. Another way to think about this is story, the inner child story. Because the inner child story of it must be me, there's something wrong with me, I can never get it right, the world's against me, I can never be successful, I don't deserve it, all the things we've talked about in all of these videos. We have to kind of start to deconstruct that story. But that story is very powerful because over the years, it's become more than a story. It's become the identity. And I think what I do with clients is I try and give them the tools so they can do it themselves, because this work is much better done when you're doing it for yourself, based on truth, honesty, and integrity. I give them the tools. Hopefully, I give them the support. If they get stuck, they book a session and we go through where they're stuck. But I think that letting go of that identity is one of the most challenging, life-changing spiritual things that you can do. I think about that identity as like a balloon, and inside the balloon is the story that you call it. And the material that holds the balloon together are emotions. And that's why the final kind of domino to knock over is this idea that do you create your emotions, or are you the victim of your emotions? Because the emotions hold the story together for the child. Because what it will say at the end of the day, nearly always, I know this is not right. Yes, of course it doesn't make sense. But then they'll say something like, I think it protects me. Or it keeps me safe. Blaming others keeps me safe. Blaming myself is the worst case scenario. If I blame myself and somebody else criticizes me, then I've already blamed myself. So it's understanding this, debunking it, taking away all the kind of the deconstruction, but then slowly getting to that final space where they can take that step out of what I would call emotional slavery, where you are the slave to your emotions. And that's when you are living in Wu Wei. I agree. I like what you said. I think that's enlightenment. I believe that that's how we should all be living. And that's the reason why we do these videos, to encourage you, to give you the tools, to give you a different technique that you can try that really works. I've been doing it for 45 years. It really works. And it doesn't matter how stubborn the inner child is. And I often say this, when I've done the golden thread and we've found the inner child, there's no monster. There's nothing there. It's a scared little child. But from that feelings of scaredness comes stubbornness. They'll dig the heels in. They will not move. But that doesn't make them a monster, doesn't make them evil. And the one thing I'll always say, I believe and I've proven the child may be stubborn, really stubborn, but the inner child is not stupid. And as long as you answer their questions, and that's what I do, I teach my clients to answer the child's question truthfully, honestly, with integrity. And that's how you make the breakthrough.
I want to just make one final point, David, because you mentioned this thing about the inner child story and how it becomes our identity of it's my fault, I'm to blame. And we've also done a teaching on this. So I'll put a link to the inner child story teaching and the inner child's reparenting teachings in the show notes if you're interested to learn more about those. But this thing about identity is very much this concept of blame, self-blame. So I can see the Wu Wei approach, the balanced, authentic way, is self-responsibility and accountability for things that we are we should be self-responsible and accountable for in terms of things we have done or actions that we could have done differently, could have done better, whatever, versus the inauthentic way, which is self-blame of ourselves as a whole person. So not just our actions, not just our behaviors. When we blame ourselves, we are blaming, we are criticizing, we are judging ourselves as a whole person. We are branding ourselves as a whole person. And that, in doing that criticism, judgment of ourselves. That is what creates the red light emotions of guilt, shame, and anxiety. Because if we go down the opposite route of being self-responsible, taking accountability for our actions and behaviors, that doesn't create red light emotions for me. That creates green light emotions or neutral emotions of potential expansiveness. I have an opportunity to change and transform here. I can learn from this. They are all kind of more expansive, more positive emotions than the emotions that we create when we blame, judge, and criticize ourselves.
Yes, exactly. And that's why we call it CCJ. Criticizing, comparing, and being judgmental. And what I find is my clients who have been CCJ'd are the worst at CCJing themselves and others. I often say to my clients, is this true for you? You treat yourself much worse than your parents or the dysfunctional situation did. You just follow their steps. That's not having your integrity. You're just saying, well, they did it. They treated me wrong, so I'm going to repeat it. And so, absolutely, you have to stop. That's when I say, stop it. Stop this. Don't go down that familiar, habitual. I hear all of these things. It's ingrained. This is what I'm hearing a lot now. Oh, it's ingrained, David. It's not ingrained. Nobody's ingrained your mind. This is your mind. It's fertile. It's fresh. As you say, it should be absolutely expansive. And if you've made a mistake, learn from your mistake. Make sure you don't make it again. If somebody's made a mistake with you, how do you want to deal with that? Do you want to carry that along with you like some kind of an anchor pulling you? Oh, well, when I was 30 years ago, somebody did this to me and therefore I can't be successful. You've already gone through it. This is what amazes me when I speak to my clients. They're the most amazing people you ever wish to meet. The stories of their childhood experiences are horrific, horrific. I often say to my clients, am I the first one to say, well done? Well done. And they'll go, well, what do you mean? I say, well, if you're anywhere near true on what you've told me, I don't understand how you got through that childhood experience.
Yeah.
There is something amazing about you. And then you're trying to convince me you can't cope.
Yeah.
You're a coping machine.
But we need to, David, you're so right, because we need to hear that from ourselves.
Exactly.
Because for so many people, they've never heard that truth, because the only voice they've heard is their inner child, blaming themselves, criticizing them, berating them.
And that's what I said. It starts with the adult part of you, the mature part of you, whatever word you want to call it, the spiritual part of you, being truthful. Look at, if you've come through a dysfunctional childhood like I have, this is why I do this work. I do this work to show you your childhood does not define you, unless you want it to. Think about that, because it happened 20, 30, 40, for some of my clients, 50, 60 years ago. They've already come through it, yet they're carrying it along with them, replaying it in their subconscious mind every day because it's their identity. Poor me, I can't cope. The world's against me. It always goes wrong. Blah, 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 blah. And you're just on the carousel. And the way you get off the carousel is how we've described. First of all, you've got to connect strongly. Truth, honesty, and integrity. Not what somebody else told you, what you believe, why you believe it. That's the golden thread. We've done many videos on this. And this subject of blame really gets to one of the nub of what the inner child does. The inner child loves blame because it keeps it stuck in its identity and it keeps it on the carousel.
Thank you, David. Well, I hope you got some value and some new insights from this teaching. As I said, I will put links to many more related teachings in the show notes to help you with this subject. If you have benefited from the teaching, please do comment, let us know, and maybe share it with someone else who you think may also benefit. David works with clients all over the world every week via Zoom video call on these sorts of issues. So if you are interested in learning more about David's one-to-one consultations, I will also put a link about those in the show notes as well. And finally, please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We produce new teachings every week, and we would love to share your journey with you. Bye-bye.